Okay, so my name is Gretchen Abuso. I teach at a university in the Philippines, Xavier University. At the same time, I'm studying PhD in sociology at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. So the title of my presentation is Colonial Traces of Immigration Aspirations Among Filipinos and its Impact in Contemporary Philippines. I'm not a migration scholar, and this is actually an excerpt from a chapter that will be published in a book published by the Bristol University Press this May. So the title of the book is Diversity, Inclusion, and Decolonization: Practical Tools for Improving Teaching, Research, and Scholarship. In the presentation, I will discuss the impact of immigration aspirations of Filipinos on higher education in the Philippines. And I also trace the roots of the culture of migration in the country to show how the Spanish and American colonialism led to the dominance of Western perspectives in teaching and research practices in contemporary Philippines, thereby perpetuating the lure of going abroad. So just to set like a backgrounder in terms of the labor export industry in the Philippines. So it was mentioned yesterday by Marianne that the Philippines is in the top 10 of migrant sending countries. So it also follows that we are also one of the countries, one of the countries receiving the largest amount of remittances. And so you can see here from 2005 to 2010, and then 2015, and then in 2020. So we're really on the top five. So in 2020, despite all the lockdowns and um, the a lot of people lost their jobs because of the pandemic, overseas Filipino workers were still able to send $34 billion in remittances. So in the United Kingdom, Filipino nurses comprise 25,000, more than 25,000 in the workforce in the NHS. So the Philippine census also estimates that there are 2.2 million Filipinos, 2.2 million overseas Filipino workers, and 12% of Filipino households have a family member who is an overseas Filipino worker. So that's about like background on the uh, labor labor export industry in the Philippines. So the policies institutionalizing overseas labor migration as an economic strategy for national development began in 1974 when three state agencies were established to oversee the systematic program for overseas employment of Filipino workers. As a temporary solution to, at that time, it was a temporary solution to unemployment in the country. Those who sought jobs abroad were low-skilled migrants who took jobs in construction in the Middle East and nanny jobs in Hong Kong and Europe. And so these were mentioned yesterday. So in 1983, Executive Order 857 required Filipino workers to send the remittances through the Philippine banking institutions. This allowed the government to collect revenue and monitor the remittances. So these two policies were instrumental in shaping how labor export is managed in the Philippines and how our economy has come to rely greatly on migrant remittances. So the governing agencies, they had a different name back in the 1970s. So the governing agencies for overseas Filipino workers may have changed names and presidents have come and gone, but these policies for overseas Filipino workers have not changed since the 1970s. However, international labor migration in the Philippines did not begin in the 1970s. So migrant labor dates back to the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, which was inaugurated in 1571. The history of Filipinos manning cargo ships began during this time when Philippine natives were commissioned to work on the galleons. So today, Filipino seafarers comprise 30% of the maritime workforce, manning merchant fleet in the global maritime industry. So also, the migrant labor brokerage by the Philippine government is inextricably linked to its economic development strategies. So as you can see in this news, at the height of the pandemic last year, so this was October, at the height of all the Delta surge and return of the lockdowns. So the Philippines was really relying on the remittances to be sent by the OFWs to prop up the economy. So large, steady flows of remittances have become the country's lifeline in many crises like the pandemic and natural disasters. Migrant remittances account for almost 10% of the country's gross domestic product. In November, in November last year, the Central Bank of the Philippines reported that remittances sent to the country had already reached 31 billion. So that's from January to November. So this represented an important source of money for the families of those 2.2 million Filipino overseas workers whose financial support is very important, especially during the various lockdowns imposed in the country in the last 2 years, which had severely restricted Filipinos from their livelihoods. So in the Philippines, we don't have unemployment benefits or unemployment insurance. So just imagine if you are not able to work. So money sent from family members earning from outside the country is really very important. So over the years, labor export has been labeled variously, before as a short-term economic strategy and a temporary solution to domestic unemployment. Today, working abroad has taken a nationalist turn, wherein labor migrants are frequently labeled as modern-day heroes or unsung heroes, recognizing their monetary contribution to the Philippine economy through the remittances. This is one dimension of the consequences of immigration for sending countries like the Philippines. The economic and cultural implications of labor export industry is revealed in terms of how we regard overseas Filipino workers and how we recognize their contribution to the economy. So in the next slides, I endeavor to summarize how these economic and cultural impacts are felt in the university settings. Okay, so for developing countries that are dependent on remittances, universities certainly play an important role in developing would-be migrants, and they also participate in labor export policy. So first, because guidelines and standards set by the state regulating bodies for universities in the Philippines tell them to do so. And second, because universities actively engage in opening and supporting programs that will attract these aspiring labor migrants. So, for example, the Philippine Nursing Act of 2002 is the overall policy that oversees nursing education and professional practices in the Philippines. This regulation is not a labor migration policy, but a policy to reform the sets of standards and guidelines for universities that offer nursing education. So, the curriculum for nursing education has been described as inundated with extra subjects that includes languages of popular destination countries as electives, yet neglecting local conditions and needs such as community health and medical administration in rural areas. So before this policy was passed, so the curriculum before 2002 was somewhat criticized because it was too community oriented, which was not attractive to foreign employers. So the rigor and standards set by the state regulators for nursing education is directed towards producing top quality nurses to remain attractive to the foreign job market and maintain the status of the Philippines as producers of excellent quality nurses. And just like seafarers, The history of nursing in the Philippines also traces its roots to colonialism. So this time with the American colonial government. They established the first nurse training school in the Philippines in 1907 as a healthcare profession introduced by the Americans. Nursing served to complement the modernizing agenda of the Americans and contributed to their objectives of disposing the indigenous knowledge systems in the country, which was still practiced among local inhabitants. So they painted the treatment of diseases using local beliefs and practices as primitive and backwards. The early education taught by Americans created images and reinforced the narratives that idealized the American way of life. So the mandate of pursuing and meeting the international standards is not limited to nursing. So education programs for seafarers are also mandated by both the Commission on Higher Education and the Maritime Industry Authority to design their training and education to be at par with global standards, stating that quality maritime education is a matter of national interest and an international obligation, emphasizing that the role of the Philippine government is to ensure the conformity of maritime schools makes the Filipino seafarers more responsive to the needs of the industry, thereby maintaining their global competitiveness. So, on a broader level, the Commission on Higher Education, which is the regulating body of universities and colleges in the Philippines, they released their strategic plan for 2011 to 2016, wherein they encourage universities to upgrade the quality of higher education institutions, programs, and systems in the country towards achieving international standards. So this mandate is still retained in their latest iteration. In their policy statements, the Commission on Higher Education equates or construes international global standards as a natural phenomenon, as a desirable goal that is perceived to be instrumental in achieving the country's development aspirations. Combined with the Philippine government's labor brokering strategies came with the emergence of a higher education system which is geared towards producing employable migrant workers. So studies have shown that highly educated Filipinos tend to have more plans to immigrate. So as you can see, this is different from the ones in the past, wherein those labor migrants are usually low skilled. So at this time, immigrants, Filipino immigrants are more likely to come from the more skilled occupations, especially in the health sector. So recent trends indicate that many Filipino students pursue certain college majors that promise careers abroad. So in response, Philippine colleges and universities have contributed to the expansion of these popular programs. In their own efforts to respond to the demands of their student consumers and their future foreign employers. Universities in the Philippines have therefore become embedded in the global commodity chain by producing graduates for the global economy. So okay, here's an example. So in the last few minutes, I will summarize how the same colonial traces are responsible for the culture of migration in the Philippines has led to the marginalization of indigenous cultures and linguistic hierarchy, which privileges the colonizing language of English. So, owing to the archipelago geography of the Philippines, the country is inherently culturally diverse, with more than 170 ethno-linguistic groups spread over more than 7,000 islands. Remarkably, the country has retained this cultural diversity despite suffering multiple waves of colonization. With the Spaniards, so we were colonized by the Spaniards for more than 300 years, the Americans for more than 30 years, and in the Japanese occupation for 3 years. Today, descendants of the colonial subjects that assimilated into the Christian majority those are us, and those who retreated to the hinterlands so they would continue their indigenous way of life constitute the indigenous minority. So the current privileged status enjoyed by English language is the result of the American colonization, which began in 1898 when they mandated the teaching of English in Philippine classrooms. So the Americans saw English as the appropriate language when introducing their progressive ideas about democracy, business, and civil governance. So the emphasis of English proficiency was perpetuated by the Philippine government even after the Americans transferred the governance to the Philippine government in 1935. So English continues to be one of the country's official languages, and it is the designated mode of instruction in schools. So this is very important actually. Like in our university, we are admonished when we speak in our local language, so we have to use English as our medium of instruction. So as a result, Filipinos commonly use English in business transactions, industry, academia, and in the international arena. English is a marker of educational achievement and a means of success to an improved way of life and a privileged socioeconomic class. This is not to say that English totally wiped out the local tongues, but in a country of more than 150 languages, it is ironic that Filipinos today are known globally for their competitive edge in speaking English, a foreign and colonizing language. So, the current public education system, including our higher education, our universities, was also introduced by the Americans. So, the Americans established the Pensionado program in 1903, which is a scholarship that sent Filipinos to study in the United States so they would fill government positions when they return. This is part of the ideals introduced by the Americans that continue to dominate higher education in the Philippines. So, English continues to be the language of instruction, and the fruits of American research and writing are our main sources of learning, and graduate studies in the United States is still a widespread aspiration. This is why idealization of life in the West and the aspiration to work abroad is so deeply rooted in Filipino society.